Well, we're going to have a discussion here between me and Vita about social worker practice in Indian Child Welfare Act cases. So, Vita, how long were you a social worker?
Well, I had an internship with the county I was eventually hired in after graduation. So close to a year of an internship and then 5 years as a child welfare worker.
Where were you a child welfare worker?
I worked for the city and county of San Francisco.
Are there any Native Americans in San Francisco?
Yes, quite a number of them, in state and out of state. Tribal people here, a lot of it due to relocation. And for many of you who don't know about the Indian Relocation Program, I invite you to research that because that brought a lot of out-of-state tribal members to large metropolitan areas, and San Francisco being one of them.
In fact, California has more Native Americans than any other state, but the majority of them are not on their own tribal lands, their own reservation.
Right.
They're in the large cities, as you mentioned. It would include San Francisco and Los Angeles in particular.
Right.
Now, as a social worker, as a child welfare worker, did you handle Native American cases?
So yes, so I worked with ICWA cases. We did vertical case management, meaning we saw the case from the point of ER all the way through adoption, because at that point in time, we wanted consistency for the families. So those of us who worked with Native cases stayed throughout the duration. And I also worked with heritage cases.
What does that mean?
Meaning the children that may not necessarily fall under the law of ICWA, but are Native and their families identify as such and preferred to have resources with culturally relevant programs.
I think one of the challenges that the legal system has is understanding the operations of the social service department.
Right.
And in order to, we're going to talk about that, because I don't think we can ask intelligent questions of social workers in court if we don't understand their job and how they're structured. Now, when you say vertical, is it better to have one social worker represent or work with a family from start to finish, or is it better to have zone defense? Some workers going out to pick up the kid, some workers investigating, some workers do the reunification.
Well, I would say, just speaking primarily with tribal families, our encounters with the government and with court historically has not always been a positive interaction. And so if you have social workers that are trained and work primarily with tribal families, then they're part of the community, and you get to know the families, and there's that trust that's built that's not always easily built when you have different workers coming onto the case. So for our county that I worked in, we just found that was the system that worked better.
I always thought it better. We had one division in my county where they had start to finish workers, and they got to know the family better.
Exactly.
Yeah. And did you handle Native American cases differently than the cases that involved local whites, for example?
Well, that's a great question. So, you may hear the term ICWA is the gold standard, right, of working with families, and providing active efforts is the gold standard. So because that's how I was trained in graduate school as an intern, that carried into my work. Even when I worked a lot when I was hired, mostly with residential treatment cases and children who had mental health issues. And so I just carried that standard along with it. It didn't feel like anything extra per se. I think there's this sort of misunderstanding that providing active efforts requires so much more effort. And it really doesn't. It's just, when you know what to do and where to locate resources and what is expected, then it's quite easy. And I found that, providing these culturally relevant services for families really worked well.
So one of the differences that you recognize with dealing with Indian families was the cultural aspect. And how did that play out? How do you get involved with the family's cultural background?
Well, so I was raised traditionally and by elders, and my father lived on the reservation for a large portion of my childhood. So he's also a traditional healer, and so I was around traditional healers when he was apprenticing. So I was lucky to have that experience where I know, the cultural norms that sort of carry across. But in terms of, working with tribes I didn't have much interaction with before, I took it upon myself to learn more about their parenting practices, their family structures, what's considered polite, what's considered rude, because I wanted to work with a tribal family very respectfully, and I didn't want to offend anybody. And so, just getting to know also historically what that tribe has been through. Once you get to know historically the trauma that has occurred, then you can see some of the root issues within the family that have carried on generation to generation.
So you would identify the tribe or tribes that the family was
stating they were from, right?
Right. And then you would try to learn more about that particular tribe's history, the trauma they may have experienced, in order to build trust and in order to be conversant in their culture.
And I always contacted the tribal social worker as soon as I had the information, because I viewed the tribal social worker as my teammate, and we were working with the family as a team. So
active efforts were different than reasonable efforts as you were a practicing social worker. That's what you're telling me, because of primarily the cultural aspect. Let's talk specifics. How did you develop a positive relationship with Native American, with a new Native American family? Let's say you just got out there to the house. How are you going to develop that relationship? Would you, for example, reveal that you yourself were Native American?
Yes, right away.
And don't you think that would be a giant step, positive step towards developing that relationship?
Yeah, for the most part, it was helpful.
Okay.
Because I think families knew that they would feel understood. Some of the issue then was I was, young, in my 20s. And so in our culture, the older you get, the wiser you are. Right? And comes with a great deal of respect. So I had to work with tribes and with families with a great deal of humility. And so that involved a lot of listening and being respectful and being mindful of what the family has been through. And then also, gaining an understanding, and this comes with, working with a tribal social worker, learning what parenting practices were appropriate for that tribe and so forth.
So you probably encountered maybe 10 or 20 different tribes during your work? That is, families that come from different tribes?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. That sounds about right. In my work now, I mean, gosh, we work with many, many tribes. So, it's important to understand that whether you're Native or whether you're not, and when you're learning about a tribe you've never worked with before, you're never going to be an expert on that tribe, in my opinion, unless you're from that tribe. So it's important to not be boastful, but to let the family know that you've spoken with the tribal social worker just to get a better understanding of the cultural norms and so forth, and the practices. That is hugely important, but you never want to act like you're the expert of that tribe that you're not a part of. So that's really important.
It seems to me that you have an enormous, you as a child welfare worker, have an enormous barrier, a burden to overcome.
Yes.
Because somebody's coming to your door, your family's in crisis, and you say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
Right.
I mean, that's a very frightening statement.
Right.
And the fact that you identify yourself as a Native American, that's going to help a little bit. But there really
but
is.
Not always.
Oh, that's right. That's
right. It's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because, even declaring to my family that I wanted to get my MSW and go into the public child welfare realm, it was, a little nerve-wracking for them, and they didn't quite understand why I would want to work for the government. But I really saw it as a chance to create change and to promote healing in systems that have not been that way historically for our communities. So it would be awkward at first coming into, working with a family and identifying myself as, part of that system that historically has tried to destroy and eliminate tribal communities. But once they got to know me, and they could see that, that I was raised traditionally, and that I was doing the best that I could to work with the family and not tell a family what to do, because I didn't, you can't walk in with this sort of domineering tone. That's not helpful in working with any family, to approach it that way. So I really approach things as, this is an opportunity for healing. So let's put a plan together. Let's figure out what your family needs together.
I can't help thinking that there are many child welfare organizations around the country who have to deal with Native American families who don't have a Native American on staff. And I don't know how you fix that. I remember we had one in Santa Clara County, and that was years ago when I was involved. And that seems to me helps a little bit. But what about those jurisdictions where they just don't have that resource available in their child welfare department?
I know exactly what to do. You have a number of options. You can always reach out to us for sure. That's, but also I always encourage people to reach out to their local tribal communities. And that means, whether they're federally recognized or non-federally recognized tribal groups in your area, reach out to them, schedule a meet and greet between your office, schedule a luncheon or, coffee and pastries and get to know one another, or, start up an ICWA roundtable in your jurisdiction. I mean, there are so many ways.
And you don't have to be Native American to do these things. You're just reaching out as someone who wants to know about the local culture, the people, the resources.
Right. So if you're a judge, I would encourage you to find out which tribal courts are in your area and reach out to that tribal court judge. If you're an attorney, like I said, maybe do a meet and greet with your office and your local tribal community. Or another way too is, many of our agencies, our tribal agencies here and in all over the nation, have community gatherings. So monthly potlucks or opportunities to do presentations. Your office could come and do a presentation at one of these dinners or attend and get to know people. There are so many ways that you can connect with tribal communities that's very neutral and can be very positive and can be life-changing.
Substance abuse is a terrible problem
Yes.
within the Native American communities across the country. And part of that, I'm sure, relates to trauma and the impact of trauma on Native American people. What would you do with a family that you encountered after a tragedy occurred, an emergency situation, to try to steer that family towards substance abuse treatment that would work?
Okay. So what I would do, first off, is work with the tribal social worker. And I would see if that tribe had reserved beds in residential treatment, or if they had, even if outpatient was a possibility, if they had already connected with a particular treatment center that they prefer working with. So that would be my first step. If they didn't have a preferred substance abuse treatment center, then I would look in that person's area, or here in the Bay Area, we have Friendship House, which is a wonderful substance abuse treatment program specifically for Native American people. And a number of tribes have reserved beds in that treatment center so that whenever somebody from their tribe is in need of treatment, they have an opportunity for that healing. And, that program is different because they incorporate so many traditions that we're used to and familiar with into their program. So they're not only addressing the current substance issues, but they're also addressing things like historical trauma and generational trauma.
Now, would you work on getting the child enrolled in his or her tribe?
Absolutely.
Well, yes. Why is that important?
It's hugely important for a number of reasons. So, number one, it creates that sense of belonging. They have a community. Whether they're enrolled or not, they still have that community that's tangible to them. But there's something about becoming a member of your tribe that is so powerful. And when you're able to empower a child like that, where they feel like no matter what, there's a whole community waiting for them and available to help them whenever they need it, is huge. And the other is, maybe the child has an opportunity to gain per capita or an investment in part of the tribe's financial gains. Maybe they're going to hold a trust open for the child when they reach a certain age that they could have access to. Maybe there's funding for, college or other such endeavors that would be hugely beneficial to the child. So if there's an opportunity to create structure, empowerment, balance, community,
this is great. This is like instant family finding.
Right.
And family finding is so powerful because suddenly you feel connected to other people who share your DNA, and that may or may not be true with the tribe, but you're sharing cultural traditions and history, and you're a part of that now, officially a part of it.
Yes.
Oh, well then, I know it's not officially your job description to help with enrollment, but you see that as something that you would help the family take those steps to get the enrollment.
Absolutely. And, sometimes the enrollment process can feel overwhelming or cumbersome if you've never helped a child get enrolled in their tribe. And every tribe does it a little bit differently. Sometimes they do it by blood quantum. Sometimes it's by lineage. Sometimes the rules change and they've opened their rolls. Sometimes a child can be enrolled specifically for ICWA purposes only, and maybe they won't get voting rights when they're older, but to have that opportunity and to know that it's available. I just want to highlight something recently that San Francisco did several years ago for their county, because the workers were feeling overwhelmed with getting a child enrolled, and the process was sort of lingering, and they really wanted to address this and really go above and beyond with providing active efforts. So they were able to find a genealogist who was tribal, and they contracted with her. And so the genealogist took over the enrollment process and worked hand in hand, was sort of the bridge between the tribe and the social worker in this particular enrollment process. And that, man, kids were getting enrolled so much quicker, and it made, you know, everyone happy. So it was a very positive step. So if there's an opportunity for your county to contract with a genealogist, I would really encourage you to do so, because it's just been a phenomenal experience for them.
There may be some follow-up questions around that, and we're going to give you our email addresses so that
Yes.
you can ask us directly about this a
Absolutely.
little later on.
Yes.
I want to talk right now about judicial responsibilities in active efforts cases, and start with, it's the law, Judge. You got to follow it, and you also may have a state law which supplements it, and some state laws go more a higher standard than the federal law. So you need to find out about that. And we judges have the responsibility to see whether the social worker's done her job, just like in reasonable efforts, only at a higher standard. And we have to make sure that active efforts are documented in the court records. Documented is not checking a box which says active efforts were provided. That will not that's not legal. That is insufficient. You got to write it down. And that's what ICWA says. And that's why it's so important to get details. And often you have to ask questions. And one of my mantras, judges are inquiring magistrates. Judges must ask questions. And if you don't see your judge asking questions, you, attorneys, need to ask those questions. Be aggressive about this. You can do a great deal of good in your courtroom by asking questions of the social worker about the specific steps she took to meet the active efforts requirement. Maybe the judge doesn't feel comfortable asking questions. Well, attorneys, you should feel not only comfortable, that's down the middle of the plate for you. You're ready to go on it.
And I would just like to jump in and just say, as a social worker, I had that expectation that I would be called out in court or out of court. You know, once everybody had my case plan and court report in hand, I knew I had to be very clear in my documentation. So anytime I had a conversation with anybody from the tribe or with a family member, I stated the date, the person I spoke with, even the time, and explained what was discussed. So there was no question. When I would do up a case plan, if I clicked the box for general counseling, in the notes portion, I put why, you know, that they were being seen at the Native Health Center, general counseling once a week, or if they weren't, then I would explain why. So the more details, the less questions there will be. If your case goes up on appeal and a qualified expert witness is looking through all of the, you know, case plans and the court reports and you know, all the information presented, and they can't tell if this person has received culturally appropriate resources, that's going to be a problem.
So what does this recording have to do, Judge, Well, first of all, you have to say what the issues the family is facing. Now, some of this information is going to be contained in the social report, but you can make reference to it. But you've got to identify the issues that are facing the family. And then a list of the active efforts that the social worker contributed, that she provided, that you and the social worker agree this is the answer that this family needs. These are the services that will address the problems that you have identified, and then dates, persons contacted, other details of how the active efforts were carried out, and then the results.
Right.
This, I mean, Vita knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The judges may not know what I'm talking about because checking the box will not do it. It's simply not the law. You've got to identify, analyze, see what they did, and then see what the results were. That's what active efforts are. Now, let me ask you a quick question.
All right.
This family has real trouble with transportation, employment, visitation, counseling. How are you going to help them?
I would reach out to extended family. I would reach out to see, can Auntie provide transportation? Could, Grandpa help with tutoring? I mean, that's what family is for. And in a tribal community, we all step in, even if we're not related to a family. If we hear that a family is suffering and we can help, then we will.
But you're not going to do that unless you have convened the family somewhat.
Exactly.
And that, right. You feel comfortable convening family tribal
groups? Absolutely.
That's part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's like, by the way, Native Americans are indigenous people. The Maori in New Zealand are indigenous people. And what did they invent? They invented family group conferencing. Well, guess what? The Native Americans in the United States, they don't call it family group conferencing, but that's what they do. They bring the family together and they say, this is our child. We got a problem here. What can we do to help mom and dad out and ultimately the child out? And so it's no surprise that family group conferencing is something that you practice as a social worker.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mentioned that judges have to be inquiring magistrates. Well, judges sometimes are shy about that, and I urge the attorneys to overcome the judge's shyness and you ask the questions. Ask them, get the social worker on the stand. If you've heard Vita here, she's ready for you. She anticipates a horrible time in court with attorneys pounding on her, but she's prepared. She's thought about this thing ahead of time. When you do that, suddenly the ripples go through the rest of the department that, oh, when I go into court, I may get asked about active efforts. Uh-oh, I better prepare. That's going to make me do more work. Well, I've never done that before. Oh, but I have somebody on the staff here who's going to help me prepare more adequately for the withering cross-examination that the attorney for the child is going to give me when I go to that hearing. So, any of you have questions for us? We're prepared at this time to talk about what we've said or other issues relating to active efforts. And so I'm going to call on Brooke and Daniel to help us technologically receive those questions.
Sure. So thank you guys so much. I do have a couple of questions that folks have written in, so we'll start with those and then we'll open it up for people to raise their hands if they'd like. So the first written question is, where ICWA applies due to the involvement of an Indian child, is the requirement for active efforts applicable to all children subject to the action, even if non-Indian children?
I don't understand if they're not Indian children, how ICWA would apply.
Is it in reference to you're still asking questions, you're still conducting inquiry and having a hint that this is a Native family, or this is not a Native family? But
Yeah.
do you still have to provide active efforts?
If you haven't, if the judge hasn't determined that this is an Indian family, but they're still investigating, who's the higher standard?
Yes.
If you don't,
Mhm.
and you later on find out that it's an Indian child, you got to start over.
It's going to create problems.
It'll just.
So act as if from the start.
Yeah. So, and a number of judges I know figured this out years ago, and they said, until I make a finding that the ICWA does or does not apply, I've got to use the higher standard. Once somebody says, oh, I think I may have Indian heritage, because then the investigation starts. You start digging and you talk to grandma, because the kids, the parents are kids. They don't know anything about the background, but grandma may or great aunt may, and that's what the social worker's doing.
That's right. And I just want to interject on that topic that it's important that you speak with every new family member that comes into the case about Native ancestry. And not everybody has the entire picture or
That's right.
the entirety of the information that is needed, because you have to remember that, you know, for a number of years, it wasn't safe to be Native, it wasn't safe to claim your ancestry. And so a lot has been hidden. And so that's why, you know, when you're working with families, sometimes they don't feel safe disclosing their Native heritage. So it's important for the social worker to be clear about the importance of, you know, of these questions asking about ancestry.
We have that happen all the time in our appellate law,
Yeah.
where we're at the permanency planning hearing and somebody walks in and says, oh, didn't you know that we have some Choctaw from Granny on this side? Oh, does that set you back? Everybody, and delay in the court system is bad for kids, particularly if they're out of home. So you've got to do that investigation up front.
Yes.
You got to talk to as many people as possible, so you, with a clear conscience, can say this is or is not an ICWA case.
Right.
Right.
So just to follow up on that, what if we have a mother who has 3 children with 2 different fathers, and one of the children is an Indian child due to the father's paternity, but the other 2 children are not?
Well,
So
you have two
that
different legal standards.
Right.
You have to.
Okay.
You'd hope that everybody would be at the higher standard, but legally you don't have to have these non-Indian children. The judge has to make several orders. This child is an Indian child. This child is not an Indian child, and this one's not an Indian child, and move from that.
Okay.
It's going to make it tricky because the kids are probably a sibling group in which everything is going to happen the same to them. So the other 2 may be bumped up accidentally, but they don't have to be.
Okay.
They don't have to have active efforts because they're not Indian children.
Okay. Next question. How does active efforts for ICWA comport with the appellate court opinion that a social worker does not need to, quote, take the parent by the hand, unquote, with regard to reunification services?
Well, I know that appellate court decision, and I think it's wrong. In fact, given certain circumstances, the social worker has to take the parent by the hand or find someone who will take the parent by the hand. I really like this question because the general discussion level at the appellate court level is, gee, I really don't want to change where this child is now because it's been a couple of years and this is a technicality. And the social worker didn't do a great job, but I'm going to say active efforts were met. You've got to break it down into what the social worker should have done, whether she did it or not. Specifically on visitation, on getting employment, on getting that counseling, on all the aspects of the plan, did the social worker get the job done? And when you hear that there's been no visitation for 6 months, or you hear that the referral to counseling was a good referral, except the mother was just given a list and nobody on the list was gonna do it, social workers got to intervene there.
Right.
handing the paper to the client and saying, go do it, is
Not sufficient.
not sufficient. And that means if that's not sufficient, well, what does the social worker have to do? Take her by the hand, make sure that the connection with the counselor happens, and then monitor it, which means to me, how often are you seeing your client? How often do you have communication with her?
And as a social worker, if just using that example, I would make sure that the parent had transportation to that initial intake appointment. Would probably take the parent myself and go with them into that intake appointment, make sure everything was set up appropriately and that mom felt comfortable and that requirements and services were in place and everything was okay.
And that's the kind of questions you should be
Mm-hmm.
stressing in court.
Mm-hmm.
You want to find out not that the service was mentioned, but
Right.
was mom engaged in the service?
Mm-hmm.
And was it the right service?
Mm-hmm.
And did the visitation take place?
Right.
And in fact, one of the problems that only New York seems to have addressed is, has the social worker worked with the child and the parent to build a relationship between them? Because sometimes that's a fractured relationship.
Right.
And New York actually has a finding, and they have some reversals in which they say social worker didn't work on that aspect of the case. All social workers should be concerned about whether there is a positive relationship between the parents and the child, and if it isn't there, then what did you do about it?
And you know what, just kind of interjecting a historical aspect on there since first contact, there has been this mindset of, tribal children are better off in a non-Indian home and given the American dream and so forth. And that's just not working for tribal community. Tribal children need to be connected and remain within their own communities as much as possible. They have to have that connection. And so just as you mentioned, rebuilding that fractured relationship, I think for any child, they need that time to heal.
And to feel connected.
Right.
To feel a part of something bigger than yourself.
Right.
We all, as human beings, need that. And in terms of the Native Americans, they have that. It exists, and we have to make sure it's there for them. Any further questions, Brooke?
Yeah, we have another one. Do you have any suggestions when working with tribes in rural communities without access to as many services?
Yeah.
I would say it kind of depends on the services that they're seeking, right? So I think in terms of, when you're not able to provide those culturally appropriate services because of location issues or, there's just not that many services available in a particularly rural community, then that needs to be noted in the case plan and in the court report. I think working with the tribe and in coming up with creative solutions, is important. That's why working hand in hand with the tribal social worker is really important, because, maybe neighboring tribes can, have a different array of services and maybe they're willing to help provide those services for a child from a different tribe. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that you can get creative in providing these active efforts for children.
I got an email last month from a court improvement program director who said, well, I've got these little villages out in nowhere. And she wasn't talking about active efforts. She was talking about reasonable efforts, which is a lower standard. And she says, what do I do? There are no social workers in sight. We haven't got any services out there. And so how creative can you get? I suggested a circuit social worker. somebody who's available from the state or from the county or whatever the geographical configuration is, to go to that village maybe once a week or once a month and to work with that family or that particular parent. The other would be if they can locate the tribe, maybe somebody could move down and stay there with the parent for a while, because the move-in strategy is one that works very well, particularly with disabled, mentally challenged parents. You get another person in the house and things really settle down and things work out. But creativity is what Vita said, and I was just throwing off some ideas I had. Get together, sit down, and try to figure out a plan. Get the next door neighbor involved if that's a person who can help out. There has to be an answer for these things, and the idea, well, we can't do anything, is unacceptable. You can do something.
My other thinking too is that a number of families I used to work with, they always wanted to work with a traditional healer because that's part of our culture. You know, when you're ailing with something emotional, physical, whatever, you go see your tribe's traditional healer to help. So that, you know, many traditional healers are willing to travel to see the family. Or if you have a child or a parent that is in residential treatment or juvenile hall, then ask that agency for permission to have the traditional healer come on site and work with that individual. That's hugely helpful. The other thing too is that many tribes are getting great capability with installing you know, Wi-Fi and cell towers and all of that. So, you know, in terms of visitation or even, you know, getting general counseling by Skype from a native service provider, you know, in another state or a few towns over, what have you, even if you have to get creative in that regard, do it, you know.
You may want to partner with the attorney for the child, that is social workers.
Yes.
Or the attorney for the child may want to partner with the social worker, because you're looking at the same problem.
Right.
Here's my favorite line out of the article I just wrote. The social worker must take action to assist the parent overcome many challenges. That may mean that the social worker goes with the parent to service providers to ensure that the parent is enrolled, understands how he or she will participate in the program. It may involve the social worker transporting the child and or the parent so that visitation takes place. It may be that the social worker takes the parent to employment interviews. It may mean providing temporary housing for a parent and child. It should mean that the social worker is working closely with relatives and tribal members, urging them to provide support for the parent. And it certainly means that the social worker is in regular contact with the parent to determine how the parent is working on the case plan. Social worker must be ready to take whatever action is necessary to keep the parent fully engaged in the reunification process. And that's what active efforts is all about. And those words, active, and they appear in the regulations. And you should have them on the tip of your tongue when you're talking to the judge about whether the social worker did his or her job. And don't feel like you're being mean to a social worker. Don't feel like, oh, gee, I really like her, I'm not going to hold her to a higher standard. No, set the standard high, and guess what? Other social workers will get the message the same day. They'll learn that it's a rough place to come to courtroom, into the court, if you haven't done your work outside the court.
Thank you. Yeah, we're good. It's time to wrap up now, and we don't have any more questions, but I think that was a great way to end the webinar with those wise words. And I just want to thank both of you. This has been really informative for me. I always learn something new every time I listen to Judge Edwards speak, and Vita, I've learned so much new from you as well. So I really appreciate both of you participating. And for those of you who are attending the webinar, we'll be sending out some follow-up surveys. Please let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see in the future. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.